increasingly clear that Bashar al-Assad is winning the war in Syria, the policies of the EU and the United States have not adjusted to this reality. In Europe, there's also an increasing awareness that the Trump administration's objective is regime collapse, even though that will prolong the suffering of the Syrian people and create new refugee flows and other externalities that will affect the region and Europe in particular. Julian Barnes-Dacey of the ECFR has recently written a paper that addresses a lot of these issues, and we will be talking about that today. So the question then is, how can the US and the EU best advance their interest in Syria today? And what are those interests at this point? Is it simply to counter Iran and Russia? Might there be other alternatives that would be more viable, and what would those alternatives be? To address these issues, ECFR and Quincy have put together a fantastic panel that will be moderated by John Hudson of the Washington Post. For all of those of you who are joining us through Zoom, you can ask your questions using the Q&A function. Those who are joining through YouTube, you can do so as well using the chat box in YouTube. And we will get to the Q&A probably half or so way through the conversation when John decides to move in that direction. But so any further ado, I want to hand it over to John from the Washington Post to introduce the panel and kickstart the conversation. John.
Thanks, Trita. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you guys. This is a very smart group of thinkers, and I've been excited about this conversation this week. I'm just going to begin by introducing the panel. We have Stephen Simon, the professor of practice of international relations at Colby. He served on the National Security Council in the Clinton and Obama administration. We have Dr. Reem Turkmani. Dr. Turkmani is the director of Syria Conflict Research Program at the London School of Economics. She's a member of the Women's Advisory Board to the UN Special Envoy to Syria. And we have Julian Barnes-Dacey, the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations and author of the recent report, Society Max, How Europe Can Help Syrians Survive Assad and the Coronavirus. Now, among the things that Julian's paper argues is that the US is furthering the collapse of the Syrian state in order to strengthen leverage at the negotiating table to broker a transition. But Julian contends that, quote, the end result will not be a transition, but an exacerbation of the country's Assad-directed implosion, leading to increased Syrian suffering, more refugees, and wider space for an extremist resurgence. I was wondering, I just wanted to start with Reem. Clearly, Julian comes from a place of concern about the humanitarian situation in Syria. And I was wondering if you could describe to us just what that situation is right now as the coronavirus spreads in the country.
Thank you very much. I mean, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate despite that the level of violence have actually, been dramatically reduced in some parts of the country, at least in the government-controlled areas. But the economy is in extremely bad shape. I mean, the currency devaluated. For example, the Syrian pound was about 50 Syrian pounds against the dollar in 2010. It's now almost 1,500 Syrian pound against the dollar. The consumer price index for the food have jumped around 22 times in 10 years. So the loaf of bread, for example, the price of the loaf of bread is now 20 times more expensive when the wages have only gone up around 2.5 times. So as a result of this, the war, the failing policies of the regime, some of the economic sanctions, now more than 85% of the Syrian people live under the poverty line. And although Syria is divided to 4 different security controlled areas, but the economy of the center, economy of Damascus still impacts the whole areas, like the exchange rate has an impact on all the area. Just to give you an idea about the situation of the economy and what it means on the life of ordinary people, the total accumulated economic loss in Syria reached almost $500 billion by the end of last year, this is around 8 times Syria's GDP. The dependency on the import have increased dramatically. As a result, the hard currency reserve, which was about $18 billion, is now completely depleted. Now, of course, there are impacts also now because of the corona crisis, with this the country divided into 2 different parts, and with coordination and communication across all the country, extremely important to combat the coronavirus and to have coordinated policy. Unfortunately, the lack of coordination is impacting the ability to respond to the virus, and the completely collapsed, not completely, I would say almost completely collapsed health system also means that Syria's capacity to respond is very weak. We estimate that they will only be able to handle around 6,000 cases. Beyond that, there will be no more capacity to take any people in ICU beds.
And what sort of impact do you think international sanctions have had on the situation in Syria from a humanitarian perspective?
Oh, it's first of all, I mean, let me just make one thing clear. We cannot blame everything on the sanctions. It's a very mixed situation. I mean, we're talking about war economy. The regime is to be blamed first and foremost, but the sanctions certainly had an impact in several ways. First of all, they affected the exchange rate of the currency. They affected the country's ability to import and export, because now all the sanctions on the banking sector, and also the de-risking factor, which is not exactly the sanction, but the fact that now all the banks would rather not take the risk and deal with Syria and then pay heavy fines rather than taking whatever benefits they're going to take from dealing with the country. So everyone is shying away from dealing with Syria, even in things like exporting medical equipment. Right? Just to give you one example, like many or large number of the Syrian hospitals, especially the private ones, have medical equipment, like the heavy equipments, like the MRI machines, the X-rays, they're all coming from Europe. And because of the sanctions, they haven't been able to import any parts or upgrade any software. So many of them are sitting there now broken, unusable. Many companies, like the pharmaceutical business in Syria, was very flourishing. And because of the sanctions, all the European and American companies withdrew all the licenses from the manufacturers, so they no more can manufacture the European and American medicines, and the quality cannot be controlled anymore. So they have to go and resort to alternative resources with much worse quality. The overall, the economy, because of the sanctions, shifted from being functioning mainly in the formal arena to the informal one. So everything is now happening through cash, through transactions that you cannot trace. So the level of corruption that was already high is now much, much higher. The private sector as well, which was divided to mainly 2 parts. Part that was very closely linked with the regime. These are the crony capitalists, the big corrupt guys like Rami Makhlouf or Samir Foz. And then there's the rest of the private sector, small and medium enterprises who are not linked to the political regime. Some of them, like the big ones, sometimes they have to pay fees here or there only to get what they should really legally get, not to kind of get something that is illegal. To get their own rights, they have sometimes to pay some fees. So the private sector that is not linked to the regime have been dramatically damaged because of the sanctions. They no more can deal with the rest of the world. There's no business to run anymore. I mean, even if you manage to resurrect their business, there's no cycle inside the country. And then the big guys, those who are linked to the regime and those who are very well connected internationally, that they can find their ways how to circumvent the sanctions, how to have bank accounts in Panama or overseas, those actually flourished. They did very well, and now they have monopoly over the private sector and part of the public sector in Syria. So the big guys, the big sharks are now bigger, and the small fish have been completely crushed. As I said, we can't blame all of this on the sanctions, but they've been certainly part of reaching this very bad image.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you spelling that out. And Julian, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Society Max paper that you spell out seems aimed at trying to improve these conditions and doing what Europeans can to improve those conditions without in any way trying to sort of normalize Assad or give him some sort of imprimatur that the Europeans would view as politically unsavory. So how would you do this? And I was wondering, in what ways do you think you talk a lot about empowering sort of Syrian civil society um, uh, but I'm wondering how that would be done in practice.
Thank you, John. Well, firstly, let me just agree with Reem that, I mean, the problem is very much Assad, the mismanagement and the corruption of the regime. On top of that, you've had the economic crisis in Lebanon. You've now got coronavirus. The country is hurtling towards a very dark place after 9 years of conflict for reasons that are very much centered on what's happening in the country and the region. My concern with Western policy that it is still focused on a transition agenda, and the US government in particular is looking at how it can use its tools of pressure to further that goal in a way that is only likely to further feed into that deterioration. And my fear is that effectively the US goal and the European goal of transition is unattainable. You're going to see a further unraveling as the government continues to hold on to power. That will first and foremost hurt the Syrian people, and then obviously have spillover effects in the region and for Europe more than the Americans that we should be concerned about. In terms of what I propose in this paper, look, I think I say very clearly, what can be done is very limited. There is clearly not much space. The regime is corrupt, it's brutal. It does not want to let the West in there to support civil society or what have you. But I think what I'm arguing is that there needs to be a kind of a fundamental shift of focus. Away from a short-term transition agenda, which continues to drive the Western policy despite talk of compromise and deal-making. If you deconstruct what is actually being asked in terms of a kind of transition and elections and reform, it still amounts to transition. And to focus instead on a longer-term process, acknowledging that Assad is not going anywhere, and thinking therefore, what can one do to strengthen Syrian society? Syrian society has developed and strengthened itself in enormous fashion over the last decade. Despite everything that's happened, they have resisted Assad in a myriad number of ways. They are doing that on a day-by-day basis, finding multiple ways to work around the regime in small and localized ways, despite what a lot of people would say. And I think the question is, can Europeans and others think about means to try and strengthen their capacity to do that? And I think that does mean that we need to take our foot off the gas and stop pushing in a direction that actually pushes alongside Assad, and to start saying, well, actually, how does one resist that? How does one move in a different direction? And so there I would put a series of measures on the table. I don't think one could do anything remotely political. I don't think this is about kind of empowering opposition movements, resistance on the ground, advancing a political agenda. I think it's about, well, strengthening the Syrians' capacity to breathe on the ground, helping them with core infrastructure that is about Syrian lives rather than the state itself, whether that means moving away from only providing narrow humanitarian support towards early stabilization, humanitarian plus that provides some education, healthcare support that might even involve building new schools, building new hospitals, whether it means being smarter about how we make sure that sanctions and exemptions are actually working. Because there are exemptions. The US government, the Europeans come out very loudly often saying, well, there are plenty of exemptions. But they know that those aren't working, those exemptions. And so it's much like what's happened in Iran. Everyone is too scared to do anything. And so the humanitarian inflows that are legally permitted are not actually happening. And I think there's a duty of responsibility on Western players to think about what they can do to actually make those work. And I suggest that the Europeans might need to create some kind of insects vehicle to get around the zero-sum European position on this. I think we can do more on a digital basis in terms of engagement with Syrians on the ground. I think one could channel direct resources via UN agencies in terms of helping Syrians to have the resources to build up their homes, establish businesses. So I think there's a whole range of things we can do. These are mostly detached from a political agenda. They're not advancing that reform change that we would all like to see that is mandated by the UN. But they're acknowledging that the political change is not going to happen anytime soon. Let's empower, strengthen those forces on the ground that can still make a difference, can advance our interest in some form of localized stability, and have, frankly, the best shot of trying to change Syria over the long term, because I don't think that change is going to happen in the near term. And the more we push on that agenda, the fear is that we only make the situation worse, to the detriment of Syrians first and foremost, but also to ourselves.
You know, Julian, I was speaking to a senior administration official on Monday who deals with Syria policy, and I told him that I was going to be talking about this paper, and he'd read the paper before I asked him about it, and he said, you know, this isn't surprising, but obviously there's pretty strong disagreements about this in the Trump administration. And one of their concerns is that it's very difficult to get, you know, money into to Syria for the civil society, for a range of things, that without channeling money that somehow gets its way into regime hands. How would you respond to that type of criticism?
So first of all, I would say, look, there is going to be some benefits that are accrued to the regime by this kind of approach. That's undoubtedly true. If you are if you're allowing the UN to do more in terms of development, if you're doing more schools, more education, more hospitals, that takes a burden away from the governance responsibility that the regime can't manage. It diverts some of the pressures that they are facing on a day-to-day basis from an angry population. I think what one can do, as I said at the outset, can only be very limited, and it needs to be based on sound principles. I mean, I think one has to focus on small projects on a localized basis. I think that there is both the history of international NGOs doing some still very valuable work on the ground, and there are a number of efforts now being tested by a number of parties to try and assert some kind of control over what their money is being directed to on the ground, in terms of ensuring that actually the money is going towards the project implementation that is desired. Look, the regime is going to be a problematic actor. It has its own needs in terms of trying to keep the country afloat, so it also has a desire to a certain extent to get some international aid. It has domestic pressure. I think we are going to have to try and navigate that and see whether one can make a positive difference. It may well be that this approach does not work. It may well be that one has to acknowledge that anything one does is diverted into corrupt mismanagement by the regime. But I don't think we are seriously testing the outer, or even testing the minimal barriers of what one could be doing to further this agenda. There is no societal support mechanism underlying the American and European approach to Syria today. It's all about pressure. It's all about getting the Russians and the Iranians to feel the pain, trying to get the Syrian elite to push Assad out. None of that will happen. We've had a decade of existential conflict. The Assad regime has not walked away. And so I think we need to try a new approach. We need to recognize that that won't work. We need to recognize that Syrian society needs support. They are the only vehicles of change over the long term. And we need to be creative, testing ways of providing them further support, doing it in a small incremental way, putting back if need be, but effectively having, shifting our frame of approach towards Syria after coming up into too many dead ends, frankly.
And Stephen, the U.S. position that was made clear to me this week was that their feeling is that they have a lot of leverage by refusing to give any sort of reconstruction funds. They see the Russians and the Iranians, trying to find someone to foot the bill of reconstruction for Syria. And when they're confronted with this ideas that Julian is proposing, they say, why should we do this right now? Especially, and there's a lot of administration attention being put towards Assad's cousin, who posted the two videos on Facebook last week, critiquing the Syrian regime. as unique and rare fissures in the regime. You know, from their perspective, you know, a potential sign that this pressure may be working, and now wouldn't be the time to take the foot off the gas, so to speak. But what do you make of that? How would you respond to that?
I think, first of all, Julian's paper, I think gets this right. I think he gets his assessment of U.S. Policy really well and conveys it quite clearly. The one thing, to my mind, that didn't come across quite as clearly as it might have is the degree to which the administration's policy is, you know, in a sense, you know, subject to a very mercurial administration. And there's a history of disconnects between U.S. Policy implementers, like Ambassador Jeffrey on the one hand, and the president on the other. And currently there's a weak policy coordination mechanism at the White House. The NSC and NSC staff doesn't function in the way that it does in a typical administration. So, you know, how committed the president is to this extremely punitive policy towards Syria, you know, is open to question. And one doesn't know until he decides he's going to pay attention to it. And, you know, there are a lot of other things on the administration's plate right now. But, you know, broadly speaking, for a policy that's on automatic pilot, I think you can fairly well describe it as still as a regime change policy. Now, for those, you know, who are committed to this view, to this policy objective. Of course, any sign of weakness in the regime or any indication of a split within the regime, a weakening of its solidarity is going to come across as good news because it'll be equated with success, or at least a harbinger of success. You know, the leverage we're applying is finally working. That's the interpretation that the administration's supporters of this policy would naturally project onto things like the YouTube videos broadcast by Rami Makhlouf, a cousin of Bashar al-Assad. But when you look more closely at where Makhlouf is coming from and the mast to which he's lashed himself, it's really Iran. So it's not obvious to me that you know, tensions between Makhlouf and Bashar al-Assad are necessarily a good thing, given the bigger context of U.S. policy towards Syria, which is, of course, its competition with Iran for influence in the region. So, you know, I think that, excuse me, the short answer here is that the United States lacks the tools currently to achieve its objectives of regime change in Syria. And, you know, a spitting match between Rami Makhlouf and Bashar al-Assad is not the kind of crack in the foundation that's going to ultimately vindicate this policy of regime change. I agree with Julian that you know, Assad is there to stay.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like this is just wishful thinking when it comes to looking for any sign that he could be finally breaking? And I wonder what insights you might have garnered personally from you know, traveling to Syria in 2015 and also your work in government as well. How does that inform your views on Syrian control and Assad's control over the Syrian government and the levers of power?
It's an interesting question. I mean, not from the perspective of my own experience, but more generally. There's been I would say a divided perception of the degree to which Bashar al-Assad controls Syria. And if you're on the one side and you believe that, Bashar doesn't really amount to much, he's just a puppet of the Russians and the Iranians, you're going to look at prospects for regime survival and the tools you would use to kill the regime somewhat differently than you would if you were on the other side of the divide and you looked at the Syrian political economy and you said, well, something, Bashar al-Assad, he runs this country. And, the Russians and the Iranians dance to his tune rather than the other way around, then you take a different view of the vulnerability of the regime to outside pressure. My sense is I'm more in the latter camp. I think that Bashar holds the whip hand in Syria, and he's the guy in Damascus who really runs things, and he calls the shots. So that's my impression, both from observing things up close, but also knowing a little bit about how the regime has conducted itself, how the Assad family has implemented its rule over Syria since 1970.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Julian, can you talk a little bit more about the specific entities you're thinking of as valuable groups, valuable recipients of European aid, should they decide to go this sort of third path that you're recommending away from a U.S. maximum pressure? What elements of Syrian society could we expect to be receiving new support under sort of the Julian plan?
I would say that the Syrian population at large. I think we're going to be looking at communities across the country who need help rebuilding their lives, who one will assess will favor our interests as much as their own kind of interest in having the capacity to get on with life. So I think this is not about channeling resources to the Makhloufs, to the Samir Fozes, to kind of the businessmen around the regime. This is about getting on the ground, using the NGOs and the UN and kind of those agencies that have positions right across the country to identify localized small level needs where one can make a positive difference. This is not about rebuilding Homs or Hama. This is about saying there is a district of a certain town that needs a school. This is about saying they need electricity here, they need water. These are kind of basic services that people provide. I think there are other means that can be used to channel support in terms of support at this time, in terms of channeling medical resources, some of the issues that Reem raised in terms of making sure hospitals have what they need. I mean, I don't think it's black or white as it's often presented. I mean, I think we can identify places that have genuine legitimate needs. I think we can identify specific needs in different sectors where we shouldn't have an issue. And I think we can think smartly and creatively about how we try and fill some of those needs. And I think, to be honest, if we were to stop talking so much about a zero-sum transition agenda, and again, I don't take seriously when Jim Jeffries and others talk of compromise, because you unpack it and that's not what it is. If you stop talking about that, then that also opens up some space to potentially have a more serious conversation with the likes of the Russians and others to say, look, this is not about channeling support with a political agenda to bring down the regime. This is because we have a shared interest in helping Syrians stabilize their local conditions. And maybe the Russians can be useful here in a way that they clearly will not be, so long as our ambition is to undermine their fundamental project in Syria.
Mm-hmm. Reem, the U.S. position, as I understand it, is that they say that, well, look, we're not Pollyannish about what's happening in Syria, and all we want is a sustained ceasefire. We don't have the grand ambitions that our critics criticize of us when it comes to, you know, a massive regime change effort. What do you think is preventing a sort of lasting ceasefire in the conflict? And is there any opportunity, and this is sort of a morbid way to look at it, but does the coronavirus pandemic create opportunities for a negotiated and more lasting ceasefire?
I think geopolitics is one of the biggest obstacles to a lasting ceasefire in Syria, especially the American-Russian dynamics, this kind of Iranian Saudi or Iranian American, the Turks. I mean, so I think this is one of the biggest obstacles. But indeed, internally, the regimes which never changed its strategy. Its main strategy is still to remain in power no matter what. Is also indeed one of the main obstacles. But sadly, nothing have worked so far in. I mean, I'm talking about the US and the EU policies. They didn't succeed in changing the regime, and they didn't succeed in changing its behavior as well. And the main leverage they had is their economic power. I mean, before the conflict, Syria's export was mainly about 40% with the Arab country and 37% with the European countries. Now it's almost zero with the European countries, right? And before the conflict, the export with Russia and Iran was minimal. And now it's completely dependent on Russia, Iran, China, and other countries that supports the regime. So there is a huge loss of leverage as a result of the current policies, the sanctions, the cutting of all ties whatsoever. And I think that need to be recompensated again for any American or European policy to have any impact now, and to change this dynamic, to occupy the space that is now occupied by Russia and Iran. As Julian said, there's a huge humanitarian impact, but I have to mention that actually the EU and the US are now contributing to the payment of the humanitarian bill inside government-controlled area. And this is sadly part of the money that is going to the corrupted networks. So to say that we don't want to do anything in government-controlled areas because we fear that some of that money is going to go to the regime, actually the kind of money that is most likely to go down let's say in the kind of the corrupt networks in the regime is the humanitarian one, because usually there is no strong monitoring and evaluation for humanitarian funds, and it's all, you just have to buy huge amounts of food and distribute it. There is no impact, there's no monitoring how the money is spent. It's often used to reward the loyalists of the regime. The big contracts are being given also to those who are close to the regime. So it is actually feeding into the regime in a way or another. And all what we want right now is to change these policies. So whatever is given in government-controlled areas in order to help the people, to alleviate the suffering, goes more into developmental agenda, goes more into reviving the economy, the legitimate economy from the bottom up. As I explained, the private sector, especially the micro, small, and medium, have been damaged massively as a result of the war and the sanctions. So to help that sector to come up again will be helping the Syrian people in a much more sustainable way, help revive the economy gradually. And there are ways to do this. It's not as simple as, I mean, the sanctions, okay, although they had undesirable impact, but to reverse that impact is not easy. We're not talking here about a linear process. It doesn't follow that lifting the sanctions will immediately reverse that impact. Because of this situation that we have now, that actually those who are they have monopoly over most of the businesses in Syria and the humanitarian sectors are those who are close to the regime. So there has to be, I would say, a mixed, gradual, and targeted approach that really aims at changing the corrupt environment to a more benign one that helps alleviate most importantly, the suffering of the ordinary people. And this could be done in various ways, in a very targeted, for example, there could be very targeted easing of some of the sanctions, not all the sanctions. Some sanctions, if they're lifted now, it will actually increase the resources of the hardcore institutes of the regime, the most oppressive ones. I mean, to lift only the sanctions that are really an obstacle to improving the humanitarian situation. There also, I think the EU and the US could look for parallel financing systems, because one of the biggest things is how, even if you want to support the Syrian private sector or Syrian civil society, which I think are the two sectors that need support the most right now in government areas, because not only that will help alleviate the suffering, but also it will give agency to the right people. It will give agency to the ordinary people who are not strongly affiliated with the regime. So how can you access them without going through all the channels and the central bank? I think a new mechanism needs to be negotiated. Yeah, there is a leverage there that needs to be exploited again. And there has to be new mechanism, that parallel financing mechanism. For example, there can be trust funds that are designed so that they can benefit directly the Syrian SME sector or the Syrian civil society sector. And you can put certain vetting around this trust fund, who can benefit from them. For example, people who did not commit human rights violations and so forth. So you can put your own vetting, your own conditionality, but make sure that you're reaching the right people. And this can be negotiated. It's doable, it's gradual, and it can help alleviate the suffering and bring some leverage again, because we're not expecting the change to come from Russia or Iran for a better Syria, for a more democratic Syria that respects human rights. We want that change to come with influence from democratic countries. So with more leverage from Europe and the US, we hope to see gradual shift towards slightly more democratic countries where the Syrian people have more agency. All what I care about now is the ordinary Syrian people to have agency, because they will be able to pressure the regime, which is now in a very difficult position. It's fragmented, it's running out of resources, it's being manipulated by even its own supporters, it's being manipulated even by Russia, Iran and Russia. The regime is not as it used to be in 2010. It's unable to rule the way it was able to rule in 2010. It's unable to satisfy its own people. It's unable to use the war again as an excuse. I mean, the last 5-7 years, it was always using the war as an excuse as why it cannot satisfy its own people, why it cannot respond to all their needs, the most basic needs like water and electricity. It cannot use the war anymore now as an excuse. So it is in a difficult position. And I think there's a big room here for European countries and the US to exploit this and to try and help the Syrian people.
Well, I was going to ask one more question, but then I realized that some of the really smart questions that are coming in from the people who are tuning in match some of the things that I was going to ask about. So let me just open it up to some of the questions, and I'll just dole out these to you guys, but feel free to chime in if you feel that this is relevant to your expertise. Stephen, this comes from Will Waldorf, who asks, how does the COVID-19 impact great power politics when it comes to the US-European policy in Syria? I'm wondering if you could take that question on, and also just, you know, are there opportunities? Are there setbacks? How do you sort of weigh the pros and cons when it comes to brokering some sort of change in Syria amidst this terrible virus and terrible health crisis in Syria?
Well, the U.S. formal position is that no concessions will be made to countries under U.S. sanctions that are having problems because of coronavirus. That's just the stance the administration is taking. As I said before, it's extremely punitive, and to some extent, it's it's shocking, because as with sanctions, more generally, the effect, as we've heard, falls on ordinary people. The regime is essentially immune to the effects of sanctions, and in fact benefits from them because of its privileged position and its ability to manipulate imports, smuggling, pricing, all those sorts of things. So the regime is just going to do really nicely and not going to suffer too terribly, I would have thought, from coronavirus, while the rest of the population is really going to be in trouble. I mean, there are, I think the last I read was that there were 11 or 12 ventilators in all of northwest Syria. Maybe there were a few more. The public health system in Syria has been badly damaged by both war and sanctions, both. It's a really tragic story. So the ability of the government to respond either locally or more broadly in some kind of nationwide sense is terribly compromised. They're not going to be able to deal with this. And you'd have thought that under the circumstances, countries imposing sanctions on Syria would relax them to make it easier for the Syrian people to get the kind of public health care that this coronavirus is going to demand. I tend to look at the current corona crisis against the larger crisis of climate change, for which corona is in a way just a warm-up act. And Syria has already been hard hit by this, and it's in the band of territory across the Mediterranean rim and through the Middle Eastern heartland down to the Gulf that's going to suffer very heavily from warming. And in some places, this country will be uninhabitable. I mean, in some areas of it, as things really warm up. And the more Western powers, whether it's the EU or it's the United States, the more these powers work hard to dismantle the capacity of the state to deliver vital services and to respond to these unfolding structural problems that endanger the very viability of their society, of Syrian society. The more they do this, the more tragic, the more horrific the outcomes are going to be. So, I think nothing much for the moment, is going to change U.S. policy on the coronavirus front. This is an administration, the Trump administration, as we've seen, is one that tends not to focus, too closely on human suffering and inequalities and all of that sort of stuff. That sort of gets into U.S. domestic politics, and I don't want to necessarily go there, but it's just that's not the temper of this administration. So they're unlikely to be terribly sensitive, I'd have thought, to the additional burden that corona is placing on a very vulnerable Syrian population caught in a nutcracker, really, between Bashar al-Assad and Western powers who maintain the dream or the vision of regime change. And regime change not really, it seems to me, for the benefit of the Syrian people, but for geopolitical reasons, again, having to do with the rivalry between the United States and Iran for influence in the region.
Julian, another viewer who read your paper has a question about what you would do about the parts of Syria that aren't under central government control. So, the north and the east controlled by autonomous administration and SDF. What would you do about those parts of Syria, and how would the Society Max approach that you're advocating address those territories?
Sure, thank you. I mean, so the paper was very much focused on the dilemma of how you deal with the regime. But I think the logic applies across the whole country. I mean, my view is that we should be doing more, increasing our support where we can, to help the kind of Syrians that Reem was identifying, who represent the kind of the only positive future that the country may have. So I think in the Northeast, particularly given, I would say, the Western burden of responsibility, having bombed a lot of the place in the anti-ISIS campaign, should be doing a lot more to help rebuild that. And one of the reasons that the Europeans haven't been willing to do that, I mean, the Americans haven't wanted to fund it, the Europeans haven't been willing to do it because they fear that the Americans will pull out and all the support that they've given will be channeled towards the regime. I think that shouldn't matter. I think that the Europeans should step up their support in places like Raqqa, provide increased developmental support so that Syrians can rebuild their lives. If the regime comes in later, then we would have helped Syrians to reestablish themselves in a better way to then deal with the regime. I think in Idlib, despite the presence of HTS, the extremist group, one needs to be looking at more avenues to channel in support. You have a massive refugee civilian population in that area who have been living under horrendous circumstances and conditions. I think there's an absolute imperative to find ways to channel increased support there. Clearly, as in dealing with the regime, there are dilemmas. How do you work around HTS? How do you not empower a group that has ties to Al-Qaeda? But I think there are still means, and there's a very nature of what you're providing that you can put into areas like that give you a degree of confidence that actually that is not going to be detrimentally harming your interests in so doing. So I would see the approach as an all of Syria approach, but my particular paper was more focused on the regime controlled side, given the Western perspective there is that we do need to pressure, we can't take our foot off the gas.
Stephen, there's a question that's addressed to you. It starts out, why is Syria a strategic American interest? We seem to have lost all leverage when the president pulled out the troops. A few of the dire consequences proved true. So why should the U.S. bother to reinsert ourselves into this quagmire? And then the person also listening to your commentary says, you say that U.S. policy is regime change. It would appear from the president's public comments that he's completely indifferent to Syria and happy to let it self sort out. So what are you hearing that would suggest otherwise?
Well, on the listener's second point, we're in agreement. I've already conceded his shrewd observation, really, that Trump is sort of disconnected from this. So policy tends to run on automatic pilot, carried out by lower level officials who are committed to a certain position and have a lot of flexibility in pursuing it because of indifference at the White House. And I think this is something we saw in in the winter of 2018 when the president just seemed to announce out of the blue that the United States was going to be pulling its forces out of Syria. That precipitated, quite a fierce reaction, and as a result, the U.S. presence was justified, sort of re-justified on different grounds, and perpetuated. We'll see what happens, the next time the president turns his attention, to what's going on in Syria. And he might well again say, I thought I said our troops should be out of there. What are they still doing there? And then, there'll be another, tempest in a teapot over it. I mean, in terms of U.S. Strategic interest in Syria senior policymakers have never, at least in this crisis, well, going back to 2011, senior policymakers found it very difficult to articulate a U.S. interest, a strategic interest in Syria. I mean, there are derivative interests and humanitarian interests and so forth, but a strategic one was difficult to formulate because Syria and the United States have never had close relations. Certainly in the period of decolonization, I mean, there was no close relationship, and Syria became a close partner and friend of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and was essentially a Soviet ally in the region, and was diametrically opposed to one of America's main allies in the region, which was Israel. Syria and Israel fought wars that were regarded in the Cold War context by many as proxy wars between the United States and Soviet Union. So there wasn't really that history there. And after the Cold War, U.S. perceptions of its interest in the Middle East changed, fairly substantially, and in a way that rendered policymakers pretty much indifferent to what was going on in Damascus, who was running the country, and so forth, because Syria had been greatly weakened as a consequence of the collapse of the Soviet empire, and Israel had gotten much stronger and much more able to defend itself over the course of the intervening decades. So it didn't really seem that Syria posed a terrible threat to an important U.S. ally. I mean, we never had the kinds of relationships in Syria that, for example, the Russians still do. Over those decades that Russians played an important role in Syria's defense and in other areas of Syrian life. There was a great deal of intermarriage, tens of thousands of Russians married into Syrian families. There are deep connections, what social scientists call affinity groups in these countries that tend to motivate or inspire commitments of a strategic sort. I mean, for the United States, there just really wasn't any of that. And, nobody was in a position to say, well, the United States GDP is going to drop by, 2% if Assad continues to rule Syria or something like that. I mean, it just really wasn't the case. So the U.S. involvement in Syria was aligned with this sense that there wasn't anything strategic at stake. I mean, it is a bit surprising in that context that the United States played such a big role in arming and training a certain segment of the opposition to Assad. But even there, those kinds of operations that are lie below the radar, certainly of public awareness, are seen as ways to, agitate for your objectives without actually putting your prestige as a country, at stake in the outcome. So, it was a limited kind of involvement. It did have a dramatic result because it, to the extent it succeeded in attriting, lessening the Syrian regime's capacity to fight the war, the Russians were more motivated to step in and help their old friend Bashar al-Assad. So, there not much of a stake really for the United States in Syria, and that sort of cold calculation determined the way in which the United States has since dealt with the terrible situation in that country.
Mm-hmm. And we have about 2 more minutes until I'm going to pass things off to Trita to wrap things up. Reem, this question comes in from Max Abrams. Have you seen any evidence by the international community that they misplaced its hand in the conflict in terms of supporting jihadists who extended the war, exacerbated our terrorism, and harmed the local population? I think he was also asking, do you think that this could ever happen? This would ever happen again? A sort of international effort to work with rebels and armed groups in the effort of pushing out someone accused of mass atrocities and someone who's documented to have so much blood on his hands.
No, I can't speak of a direct evidence of the kind of US or EU supporting directly terrorists inside Syria, but being involved, sometimes this, some of their support indirectly benefits some of these groups, and this is sometimes it's just very, very difficult to avoid. Some of the policies, I would say, for example, the way the US fought ISIS in Raqqa is led to more extremism. I mean, they basically flattened Raqqa, reduced it completely on the ground, marginalized its own people, kicked them out of the city. They're unable to go back to a built city again. The extremism have increased, and the ability of ISIS to recruit new members have increased. So there's indirect impact of their policies. May I just take this at one quick point about the corona, because it was mentioned that the US may not have interest in eliminating corona in Syria, but this is not about the Syrians. Eliminating or eradicating the coronavirus is a global concern, and we're not going to eradicate this virus unless it's eradicated globally. So all the countries should have interest in combating the virus in other countries. So countries that have weak health system or conflict-affected countries should be helped to combat this virus. That's in everyone's interest. And I think there's an entry point here in Syria where the support to help the health sector so it can respond to the epidemic should be conditioned in having one central pan-Syria plan. So for example, if you want to help the health system in government-controlled area, that should also be conditioned in the regime refraining from attacking the health system in other areas, like refraining from bombarding hospitals or arresting medical staff in opposition controlled areas. So I think it is an entry point, and it can be leveraged for peace, but there has to be a pan-Syria plan and get everyone to work with each other. And that could be an entry point for starting to coordinate with each other and understand that help, if this is the Syrian regime right now is appealing to the international community, that because of the corona crisis, you should be helping me. So it's appealing to the humanitarian kind of trend. So using the same tone, I think the international community could say, yes, and from a humanitarian perspective, you should also help, the Northeast, you should also help the Northwest, and you should all coordinate together to come up with one plan.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate everybody for participating, and I want to hand it over to Trita to wrap things up.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of the panelists, to Reem, to Stephen, to Julian for a fantastic conversation. This is clearly a very, very tough issue that unfortunately tends to get more and more complicated as time goes by. But a few opportunities may exist in the near future to make some important strategic decisions to adjust to some of the new realities over there. For those of you who are not subscribed to the Quincy Institute's newsletter, I encourage you to do so at www.quincyinst.org. That way you will get notifications of all of our forthcoming panels and publications. And just in the next few weeks, we will have a couple of additional panels, a series of panels on the situation on the Korean Peninsula, a series of panels on this rush to a Cold War with China that we from the Quincy perspective are very worried about, a panel with Quincy's Steve Simon, who will be coming out with a paper shortly on how to wind down the war on terror, as well as a book talk with Quincy fellow Patrick Porter on his new book, The False Promise of the Liberal Order, Nostalgia, Delusion, and the Rise of Trump, and much, much more. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.